Well, friends, good morning, and it's great for Janet and I to be here. Thank you to Michael for his more than generous welcome, and to Mark for leading us in good worship. My word, it's like a veterans gathering, isn't it? Looking around, people I've known since college days, people I've worked with within the Baptist Union. My dear friend, Walford Luce, I call him Walford, his name's David, his second name's Walford, but when he came and joined us at Upton Vale, we had so many Davids, we all had to sort of distribute names around. So he became known as Walford, and when his mother heard about it, she was delighted because she wanted to call him Walford, and I think she was overruled, named after the great Walford Davis, the musician. So it's really great to be here, and a privilege. Janet and I are part of the retired group in Devon and Cornwall, the southwest, and we know just how much it means to us. We've got a group on Monday meeting, and it's wonderful to be here. The young rabbi was struggling a little bit in his new synagogue because there was always serious division at the Friday evening service. And he really didn't know how to sort it out. Half the congregation at one point of the service would stand, and half would remain seated, and those standing would shout at those seated to say, "You stand up at this point," and it was just so chaotic. Whatever he did was just not right. Decency and decorum had really gone out of the window. So he decided he would visit the founding rabbi, by now in his 90s, and he thought to himself, well, if I went and sought his wisdom, perhaps I'd have some greater understanding as to what happened. So he went to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, is it true that at this point in the service you stand?" And the old rabbi said, no, that's not the tradition. He said, "Is it the tradition at this point in the service that you sit?" And the old rabbi said, "No, that's not the tradition either." So he said, "Well, what is it when half of them stand, half of them sit there shouting at one another?" "That's the tradition," said the rabbi. And I can remember George Cummings. Older ones here may remember George. He was at Eastbourne for many years. When Janet and I were very young, we went to a conference, and I can recall in question time, somebody asked George Cummings, what was the most challenging thing about being a pastor? And the first thing he came back and said was people. He said, "That's my biggest disappointment." And we looked at one another, 18 years of age, and thought, how dreadful that a pastor should, say that about people. We'd only been 6 months at Weststone Leicester, and we knew what he meant. My very last time at my last sermon, I'd preached at Whetstone, and Mark, my good friend, may remember there was a man called Cyril who was there. He was a deacon in our time. And as we walked down the side of the church, having preached my last sermon before leaving for North Cheam, he got in step with me, and he said, as we walked through to the buffet at the rear hall, he said, "Well, David," I can't imitate his Leicester accent. "Well, David," he said, "you haven't in 5 years preached many bad sermons, but tonight was one of them." Now, don't think I'm not grieving. I have been healed of that particular wound. But it's an illustration of how we just can't really ignore the fact that it's often the diversity of people that's been the biggest challenge in all of our ministries. So I wanted to find a passage where we could see the diversity of discipleship and perhaps learn afresh about ministries which are now behind us, but for many of us are still active. And that's why I've chosen John chapter 11. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I'm going to take you through the chapter. But I think it would be good if we began by reading the first few verses. Let's go as far as verse 11, perhaps, of John chapter 11. It's a familiar story. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And this Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. And when he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. It is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. I suggest to you that there are images of the diversity that people have in response to a family tragedy, and then the response of Jesus. Controlling everything is the verse we've just read. That people would come to see God's glory, and that Jesus would be glorified in the pastoral event. Death is not going to be the last word. The faith of a family is going to be deepened, and sickness and death, it doesn't mean that it happens in order for God to be glorified, but the illness and the death of Lazarus is an occasion when God's glory is revealed. So let me give you the first group, and that's in verses really 7 to 16. I suggest the disciples represent those who don't fully grasp what is happening. We had a church meeting in the church we're at in Devon on Monday, and our pastor announced, it's public knowledge now, that he was leaving. And just a month ago, the associate pastor announced that he had been invited to become a naval chaplain. So the church, it would be true to say, is reeling. And we're going back, and there'll be various prayer gatherings happening. And there are many moments in our lives when something happens and we don't fully grasp what is happening. So it's no surprise that the disciples here find Jesus very puzzling. It's a common theme in the Gospels. God appears to know what he's doing, but those who are his earthly disciples find him puzzling. His timing's puzzling. That's verse 6. Jesus hears that his close friend has died, and instead of leaving immediately, which you would expect any worthy pastor to do, having heard Lazarus was ill, Jesus stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. They thought that Jesus would drop everything to go and see his friend, because that's the normal pastoral response. And then what's puzzling is suddenly Jesus changes his mind in verse 7. One moment they're not going, and the next minute they are going. So that's the first puzzle. The second is his lack of compassion for the family. That's very puzzling. The family enjoyed close friendship bonds with Jesus, and when the news comes that the one that you love, Jesus, is sick, surely Jesus will drop everything and rush to the house in Bethany. But you see, Jesus the pastor has to wait for the time appointed by the Father. It seems a harsh response. But we know that Jesus is not without compassion. He will later weep at the graveside. But as John 5 tells us, he can only move and act according to the Father and his timetable. The Son, chapter 5, verse 19, can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing. And his lack of concern for personal safety is puzzling to them. You can again see the human mindset of the disciples in verse 8. They're very concerned for the safety of Jesus. They recall chapter 10, the last time he was in the region where Lazarus has died, enemies tried to stone him. So they're saying to him, really, Jesus, do you really want to go back into a war zone of conflict? You're walking into danger. Your enemies will try to kill you. And then his language. His language is so puzzling. In verse 9, he speaks of 12 hours of walking in the daylight. So, is Jesus referring to the physical dangers of travel? Make a journey during daylight hours because it's safer. Walk at night and you'll fall in the ditch. But not for the first time in John. Jesus, somebody has called him the Johannine Pimpernel. Now you see him, now you don't. Now you understand him, now you don't. Is he elusively saying, I'm the light of the world, follow me and you'll never stumble in the darkness? And then his comments about Lazarus are puzzling. That's verse 11. Lazarus has fallen asleep, so we're going to wake him. So these questions are raised in the disciples' mind. Is he sleeping or is he dead? The disciples think that Jesus means that Lazarus is sleeping naturally. So why make a dangerous journey, Jesus, if he'll sleep off whatever's made him poorly? Except Jesus means that Lazarus is sleeping as a dead man sleeps. He tells them plainly, not plainly enough you might add, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I was glad I wasn't there so you may believe. But now let's go. So this human response of puzzlement at Jesus is so typical. We've had emails and texts since Monday, and it's obvious that people are deeply puzzled about an event that has happened in church life. And it's rounded very typically by Thomas. Everybody's had a Thomas in their congregation. Verse 16, I haven't got a clue what's happening, so let's go anyway, and then we can all die together with Lazarus. Very pragmatic. See, I think the disciples represent here ignorant discipleship. And we've all struggled with that. We've struggled with leaders who don't seem to grasp what's going on. I was speaking to a younger pastor a few weeks ago where he said his leadership don't have a clue, but he's got into a friendship with a new convert, and the new convert seems to have a clearer reading of church situations than people who've been many years in service. And what often adds to the confusion, let's be honest, we sometimes don't have a clue either. And so like the disciples, we have to acknowledge that sometimes it's very difficult to discern God's plan and purpose. I love the story of Philip Yancey. Incidentally, if you haven't read his very latest book, Where the Light Falls, accompanied by Eugene Peterson's A Burning in My Bones. It's a biography of Peterson's life by Will Collier. It isn't a hagiography, it's a very honest, scaringly honest. When I got to the end of the Peterson book, I thought, I'm not sure whether I like him anymore. And I had to go back and realize that that was warts and all. But the Philip Yancey book is, as you know, if you read it, an autobiography where he speaks very honestly about his relationship with his mother and her influence or lack of in his life. But he tells the story, and I don't know whether it's a book he had read or a film he had seen, of the father whose daughter is dying of leukemia. And he's going to the hospital on her birthday with a birthday cake that he's made. And it's in the days before mobile phones. So the hospital ward haven't been able to phone him to say that his daughter's died. So he arrives at the hospital with the cake for her birthday, and the news has to be shared, and after an appropriate season of care, he leaves the hospital and goes to a nearby Catholic church and walks in, and in the Catholic church there is this huge stone statue of Christ. And he has his birthday cake in his hand. And he stands for a little while before the statue, and in the end he picks up the cake and he hurls it at the face of the crucified Christ, and the icing just trickles down the stone face of Christ. And Yancey asks the question in the book, do you understand how that father felt? And then he quotes the passage from John chapter 6, where Jesus has fed the people, and then the teaching has become very deep. So deep that when he says, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't be part of me. And at that moment, hordes of disciples leave. And he turns to the others and said, are you also going to leave? To which memorably Peter replies, where else can we go? And sometimes I think in our lives, there is nowhere else that we can go. We don't understand everything, but we're going to respond to the one. I'm going to quote here from Frank Viola. If you've never come across his book, God's Favourite Place on Earth, it's really the whole book is about Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Bethany, the favourite place of Jesus. He says this, Jesus rarely responds in a way that fits human expectations, but he always acts according to his Father's clock. Jesus will ultimately meet the pastoral needs of this family, but he just did it in a way that no one expected, which is such a common characteristic of our Lord. So there's your first group, the disciples who represent those who don't fully understand what is happening, and that's us. But here's the second, and that is Martha, who represents the disciple who has a deeper faith than we discern. For a number of years, I've been a tramp preacher, as you know, and what would happen in my years working for the union, the staff would send out from my office a bio sheet, much in the way that a moment ago Michael drew on them. And it included things like David supports Chelsea, he likes the music of Elgar, and he often finds himself at Heathrow Airport. Well, a local church that had a Martha or a Matt, detailed person working for them, would often take note of what I'd said in the biography and would surprise me. So I can remember going to a church in Twickenham, and when I came into the vestry, there, as I sat down at the minister's table, was a signed photograph of Gianfranco Zola, who at that moment was playing for Chelsea, and they thought I would appreciate that, which I did. Another church that I went to with a gifted group of musicians played a piece of Elgar when the offering was taken up. Another church I went to, somebody worked for the ground staff at BA, and when I next went to Heathrow, I got an upgrade on a flight. Now, all this had been organised by eagle-eyed Matts or Marthas. So I want you to know this morning, I am a member, I'm a fan of the Martha fan club. People find her in the gospel, in Luke, portrayed as obsessed with serving, with little time for sitting at the feet of Jesus. Well, I think John 11 provides an alternative portrait. It gives you a fuller picture. This woman, Martha, has a very successful ministry and a depth of faith. The word Bethany, you probably know, means house of the poor. And Tom Wright has suggested that this family home was a type of care home. It was offering respite care for poor, needy people and sick people, which held a special affection in the life of Jesus. So that's why I think he loved this house. And this house of the poor explains the criticism of Judas in John chapter 12, the chapter that follows. When Mary, in his view, wastes perfume on Jesus, what does he say? This extravagant is not appropriate in the house of the poor. The money could have been better used for this house of the poor ministry. So in my book, Martha was running a very demanding support system for the poor and needy, probably struggling to get a balanced life, meeting the needs of the organization, and when she could, grabbing an opportunity to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to his teaching. So on one occasion, Jesus rebukes her for losing her perspective. When she says, "Don't you care? My sister has left me with all this work," she has a rebuke of Jesus once. But here in chapter 11, it's not that she didn't have any appetite for the teaching ministry of Jesus. She knows that in order to do the successful things she's doing, there have to be times of retreat. I believe that the church would collapse without Martha and Matts. Some of you were probably at Birmingham in 2005 when the Centenary Congress took place. And I was reminded of that event when a few weeks ago you may have seen the death of Harvey Thomas was announced. There was a magnificent obituary, I think it was in the Times. He'd worked for Margaret Thatcher, he'd worked for the Institute of Directors and regularly did conventions at the Albert Hall. And he was one of the team we recruited, along with many others, to run transport registration, accommodation, visa applications, crowd control, food halls. I could go on listing it. They had clipboards and stopwatches, and they were fantastic. They never got, many of them, to a meeting to hear any of the speakers. But without the Martha and Matts, we would never had a BWA Congress in Birmingham for 12,000 people. Verse 20, incidentally, is a cameo of what a Martha does. She goes out to meet Jesus while Mary stays grieving at home. How many times as a guest preacher have I arrived and the church secretary's on the steps looking out for you? Probably reserved a car parking place as well. So this woman that we sometimes might categorize as all admin and no prayer, all organization and no faith, all clipboard and stopwatch, look at this, surprise, surprise. This is her moment in the sun. Her faith is much firmer and more grounded in God's truth than you would discern. Follow the conversation closely. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and only now Jesus arrives on the scene. And her first words, verse 21, Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. I can imagine them saying that, goodness me, if a pastor was a day late, but 4 days. But listen to what she says. But because you're a healer, it's not too late. Even now, God will give you whatever you ask him. If that isn't the bubbling out of faith. Jesus' delay, yes, has created a crisis of faith which reveals, though, a depth in her life. Even now, God will give you what you ask, confirming what Paul would later write in Romans 5, verse 3, we rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, character hope, and hope never disappoints. This is Martha expressing her hope in God. She's not walking away, she's not angry. Even now, Lord, in her trial of faith, she believed even more in the power of Jesus. How does Jesus respond? Verse 23, he replies to Martha, your brother will rise again. Now that's the standard teaching, as you know, of the Hebrew scriptures. And she believes as a Jewess what Isaiah 65 and 66 say. There is going to be a new heaven and a new earth, a brand new cosmos with no pain, grief, or death, which is why she can say, a bit like the Apostles' Creed, yes, Lord, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. But I love this moment. It's as if Jesus says to Martha, Martha, listen to me. And we need to stand still and capture this moment, verses 25 and 26. Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though they die. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Martha, up front, do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. This is Martha's moment of revelation, akin to that earlier passage in Matthew when Peter declared he was the Christ. And you've noted, haven't you, how she's moved from I know the Apostles' Creed, to I believe. I believe the one standing before me right now is the one whom the scriptures pointed to. And this begins to explain the timing delay of Jesus. Jesus is not just here to raise Lazarus from the dead and restore him to the family. Wonderful that is. This is Ephesians 3:20, which you've lived by. For every pastor and situation we're facing, that God is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power at work that is within us. So this is your moment, Martha. Busy manager at the house of the poor, fruitfully active in God's service, but the Lord discerns a deeper faith in you, and he's drawn it out as you move from I know to I believe. In our church in North Cheam, we had an amazingly just gifted couple, faithful, reliable, always there, first to offer. And I can recall at the end of one of our communion services how Diana came forward and asked for prayer. And she said, I'll do anything. I'll deliver flowers after a service. But she said, I'm just conscious that I never feel anything. When all these prayer requests go out, I'm just, dead. I'll do something, but I don't feel anything. And said, I want to have a greater sense of compassion, so that what I do and I'm eager to do is matched with a corresponding compassion. Here's a third disciple that we will have met. We've been part of the disciples who were confused. We've known Martha's. Martha may be here today, where there is that movement from knowing to believing. But here's Mary, who represents the tender-hearted, who prompt a particular response in us. See, Mary provokes a very different response in Jesus. It's the same family, it's the same pastoral crisis, but a very different kind of personality. And it reminds us that we have to be very discerning with people, even when it's the same crisis. Mary runs and finds Martha. Remember, Martha didn't need to be prompted. She was already at the front gate looking out for Jesus. She goes to Mary and says, the teacher is calling for you. And Mary emerges immediately and falls at his feet. And then she cries from the heart, echoing the words of Martha, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Now, Jesus could have replayed the tape he's already given to Martha. As I was saying to your sister Martha a few moments ago, Lazarus will rise again, I'm the resurrection and the life. But with Mary, there's a difference. Mary kneels, she weeps, and apart from the cry from the heart, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, she's a woman with few words. And the Bible reveals that Mary has a very unique relationship with Jesus. Luke 10:39, she sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to his teaching. John 12, she knelt to anoint the feet of Jesus. John 11, she's kneeling again before Jesus, weeping for the loss of her brother. It's a tender relationship. It's a greater sense of spiritual intimacy with Jesus. She has greater freedom to share her deepest feelings. And as pastors, you'll know that you've met people like this, and you're either comfortable or you're uncomfortable with this. I often think Catholics cope better with spiritual mysticism than Baptists do. Most pastors are very wary of church members who say, Pastor, during my recent night of prayer and fasting for this spiritually needy church, at 3 o'clock this morning, I heard the Lord say to me very clearly, Janet, I'm privileged to come from a Christian family. Janet's family, they're not unbelievers, but they haven't had the same commitment to the community of disciples. But we have a wonderful relationship with them. I've been the honorary chaplain, as you will hear, marrying and burying them, and the wedding of Janet's niece took place. She went to a local church, she and her to-be husband, and they worshipped, and after the service said to the pastor, is it possible for us to get married here? And the pastor said, I'm sure it is, they live nearby. And then she said, well, actually, my uncle is a Baptist minister, do you mind if he did the wedding? And the pastor agreed. Well, because we knew we were going to be the only committed Christians there, we really wanted everything to go fantastically well. They had one gifted musician, as we had this morning, and the lady arrived about half an hour before the wedding, and I'd got everything really prepared. And she said to me, you don't know me? I said, no. And she said, I don't know the couple. But she said, I think it was, at 3 o'clock this morning, I heard God speaking to me, and I have something to share with them. Well, I'll be honest with you, my heart sank. I thought this is the last thing that we really need. We just want everything ordered and so on. And she must have seen my reaction. She said, don't worry. She said, I don't want to speak. I want to play. So it turned out that she had been given this amazing melody and it was. And we arranged at which moment in the service it would happen. And you could have heard a pin drop. And I saw straight after the service my brother-in-law, who in a moment will feature in another story, come forward and asked her, where did the music come from? And she told him. And during the reception, the niece, Sue, came up to Janet and myself, put her arm through both of our arms, and she said that was a lovely service. But she said, you know the highlight for me? So when that lady played the piano, and of course what the woman playing the piano didn't know, what we knew, was that the bride's father had been a pianist in a dance band. He had died and her mother was dead, and she felt that when that piano played, it was heaven smiling on that particular family. Now friends, where did that come from? Mary, I think, represents that tradition of people who have such a tender relationship with the Lord. In verses 33 to 35, her emotional life is wide open. It's been open all the way through the Gospels, because that's the way she's wired. And when Jesus sees her weeping and the crowd of mourners, what happens? He becomes deeply moved in spirit and troubled, verse 33. Mary's grief touches Jesus deeply. And we see the broken-hearted pastor. Her tears provoke tears from Jesus. And I think we read one of the most remarkable moments in the whole of the gospel story. Verse 35, Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, but probably the most eloquent. The tears of Jesus reveal a flesh and blood human being. Tom Wright comments this way: when we look at Jesus, not least when we look at Jesus in tears, we are seeing the Word made flesh. The Word through whom the worlds were made, weeps at the grave of a friend. A God who weeps with us deepens our understanding of God. I think it sustains us in our ministry when we're tearful and broken-hearted, to know that the Lord feels that pain with us. In one of his books, C.S. Lewis has this wonderful moment when it's in The Magician's Nephew. Diggory has an encounter with Aslan. And Diggory mentions his sick mother to Aslan. Please, please, he says to Aslan, can't you give me something that will cure mother? And up till then he'd been looking at the lion's great front feet and the huge claws on them. But now, in his despair, he looks up at the face of Aslan. And what he saw surprised him more than anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must be more sorrier about his mother than he was himself. Touched with the feeling of our infirmities. I think Mary teaches us that. But fourthly, the fourth character in this pastoral reading of John is what I've called Jesus, who represents the spiritual authority of the pastor. Whenever I've conducted a funeral service, I've sometimes found those opening moments one of the hardest parts, when the coffin is brought in. Nowadays it's not always a tradition, but at the creme that might happen, where the mourners take their place in the front row. And this can be often the moment when the family are overwhelmed with grief. They settle down, but in those opening moments they look so vulnerable and frightened. And I sense they're not only grieving for their loved ones, but they're in the presence of death. This business about direct cremations, where a family doesn't even have to attend anything now. there's no dress rehearsal for one's own funeral. And we seem to go to a lot of funerals nowadays, Jan and I think we're not only celebrating a friend's life, we're also being reminded of our mortality. And how many times have you walked up the path to the home of a family feeling very weak and helpless and whispering, peace to this house? What are we going to encounter? What are we going to say? And I suggest there are two things in these pastoral situations that are required. As pastors, we have to express the appropriate emotion. But we also, secondly, have to exercise spiritual authority, expressing emotion and exercising spiritual authority. I think both of those features are clearly seen in Jesus the pastor. He's already expressed appropriate emotion in that he's wept with Mary and the mourners, but the grief has now to be accompanied by a display of spiritual authority. And first, Jesus expresses his anger. At the tomb of Lazarus, as pastors, you will have preached on this passage and you'll have studied this phrase, Jesus once more deeply moved. Verse 38. The Greek word embramathsai, which refers to the snorting of horses, but when used by humans, it's anger. Whichever commentary you look at, they're all in agreement at this point. This is anger. Jesus angry in spirit, outraged in spirit, inexpressible anger. It's the same Jesus who with a whip of cords cleansed the temple. This is Jesus directing anger at the violent tyranny of death. Jesus, angry because the great enemy of death has destroyed the life of his beloved friend Lazarus. It's brought sadness. Everywhere people are weeping. And in the presence of all this grief, Jesus sees the misery of the human race. Don Carson comments, Jesus is raging against all the devastating features of this fallen world, the kind of anger that all of us have felt as we've seen the ravaging of Ukraine. And not to do that is less than human. This is a holy, righteous anger. But Don Carson again says this, we have to learn this as pastors. Grief and compassion without outrage makes a pastor just sentimental. Outrage without grief hardens the pastor into a self-righteous arrogance. We need the fullness of emotional response, both tears and anger. And so suddenly this righteous rage is turned into spiritual authority. Verse 39, take away the stone. And Jesus, the supreme champion over death, stands at the entrance to the tomb. And note here how Martha, the eye for detail, resorts to her default position. Oh, Jesus, don't take away the stone. Think of the smell. That's very typical of Martha. And Jesus offers her the mildest rebuke. Did I not tell you, Martha, if you believed you would see the glory of God? Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days, and we begin now to discern clearly why Jesus has delayed arriving at the tomb, because after 4 days, Satan has delivered total destruction. Now you can imagine Jesus saying, okay, grave, you've done the worst in the life of Lazarus, death. You imagine you have victory over my friend Lazarus. And the tearful pastor, who became the angry pastor, and the angry pastor became the praying pastor, now prays aloud, Father, I thank you that you've heard me and you always hear me. The whole of his life is asking and receiving from the Father. And in the midst of the pastoral crisis, he calls out to God. Lloyd Ogilvie has that great quote where he says, all insecurity in the life of a leader is rooted in an inadequate sense of belonging to God. All insecurity in the life of a leader is rooted in an inadequate sense of belonging to God. Here's Jesus. We've witnessed his tears, his anger, his prayer, and now, surrounded by all the chaos of sorrow, we see finally the spiritual authority of the pastor. Take away the stone. Lazarus come out, and Lazarus emerges from the tomb. That's spiritual authority. Tears, anger, prayer, authority. This huge range of emotions in the house of the dead. There are some funerals which you take where this is a believer that that's dying, and the church is filled with the majority of believers, and so it becomes like a Thanksgiving. There are others that are more challenging. Mark and I were talking about a friend in Whetstone who died recently, a young man, and I know that what he did was a far more challenging service. I had a challenging service when my brother-in-law died. It's a long, long story, but basically he was in the Marsden Hospital, and Janet and I, living in Devon, felt compelled to go to London to visit him. And apart from saying grace, I'd never really talked about Jesus in great depth to Doug, but I knew that I had his support in all that we did, and he and his late wife Audrey, Janet's sister, they were wonderfully loving and supportive, but deep faith chats were off limits. But this man was dying, and I just felt, as often you felt, the Spirit speaking to me, we've got to do more than just say, hi, how you doing? I knew he'd been a choir boy in a nearby church in Chelsea, as it happened. And I said, Doug, I want to do two things. I want to read a psalm you'll know well, Psalm 23. And then I want to pray the Lord's Prayer together. So we read Psalm 23, and what a gift Psalm 23 is. If ever it comes alive in moments like this, fantastic. Then the three of us stood around the bed holding hands as we said the Lord's Prayer together. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, after he had died, I was invited to do the funeral down at Leatherhead, Randall's crematorium. Wonderful. I wish every crematorium in the land was as beautifully located as that Randall's crematorium. Place was jammed, standing room only. He'd been a member of Surrey Bowls, and they were there with their blazers and their ties. And I remember him saying to me, years previously, we'd had a meal together. He said, David, I've been to another funeral today, a Bowls player, but your side, the vicar taking the service, let the side down today. I said, why was that? He said he never named him. Never named him. Did all that was necessary, committed him, and people talked afterwards. So I knew what his full name was. So I told that story, and I named him. I gave them all his names. And then I was able to say what had happened in that Marsden ward. And I said, we're going to do right now what we did in the Marsden ward 2 or 3 weeks ago. The psalm was read. The Lord's Prayer was said. And then I said a pastoral blessing over the company. I said, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord turn his face towards you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Because I felt the Lord saying to me, exercise spiritual authority in the house of the dead. That's what you've done. Be blessed in the memory of all those occasions when you've done where there's been confusion and tears and a deepening of faith. This is the moment that you have to be the representative of Jesus the pastor. So, well done, good and faithful servants. And finally, we have Lazarus, who represents the silent believer who reveals God's glory. It's a wonderful portrait, isn't it? Lazarus, not a man of few words, a man of no words. Lazarus, unlike his sisters, is speechless, doesn't say anything. His whole life is a gospel story. Lazarus performs just one action. He emerges from the tomb when Jesus gives the command, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And I'm suggesting to you as we conclude that the story of Lazarus is the story of the gospel. That as Lazarus emerges from the tomb, so Jesus will emerge from his tomb, and so we emerge from the dark tomb of sin when we place our faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. We experience personally that power, that transfer from kingdom of darkness to kingdom of light, and one day we will be raised from our grave. You see, the raising of Lazarus is the sign of the death and resurrection of Jesus himself. But what an abrupt ending to an amazing gospel story. You see, our 21st celebrity culture would demand television interviews and book tours and guest appearances on chat shows, and unlike the interrogation of the blind man in chapter 9, whose sight was restored, there's no interview with Lazarus. saying, what was it like? How did you feel during those 4 days? There isn't a word of testimony from any member of the family, no follow-up comment from any of the disciples. All we're told, verse 45, is this: many saw what happened and put their faith in Jesus. Because, dear friends, in the end, that's all that matters. The great significance of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus is the life and power of Jesus has been reflected in their lives. That's exactly what Jesus said at the beginning of the narrative, verse 4. This sickness will not end in death. It's happening so that the Son of Man may be glorified. In the end, in all matters of pastoring people, all we need to say is the life and the power of Jesus has been reflected in the lives of these people. It's the aim of all pastoring. He must increase while I must decrease. And perhaps a story just to remind us of the truth of this. It's a story unearthed by my good friend Phil Greenslade, who I went through college with and had a huge influence on our lives. We celebrated a milestone birthday a month apart, so he's my older brother by a month. And he talks about the Antiques Roadshow and how somebody turned up one day. A woman brought 2 stained, cracked porcelain pots and wanted them valued. They'd been identified as houseware from Japan, dated in the 1930s, and when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the porcelain was fired again, this time to over 1300 degrees centigrade, so that the pots began to crack and the glaze had started to crystallize. So the valuer, and you know that moment when somebody wants to know how much is it worth, the valuer said 2 things. These are just 2 very ordinary domestic utensils, and in themselves they're not worth much. But then he added these words: but in connection with the story they tell, they're priceless.